The old trapper found Josephine Anders crouched in the snow beside a wounded grizzly bear, her small hand resting on its massive head while she hummed a melody that seemed to come from somewhere beyond this world. And when he rode back to Fort Lyon, Colorado, that February morning in 1876, he told everyone in the saloon that he'd seen something impossible. "That woman's got away with wild animals," he declared, slamming his whiskey glass on the bar. "Bear should have torn her apart, but it was calm as a kitten." The men laughed, called him a liar, said the mountain air had frozen his brain. But Kade Sullivan heard every word from his corner table, and something in the old man's voice told him it was true. Kade had spent the last 8 years in these mountains, trapping and hunting, avoiding civilization except when he needed supplies. At 28, he was built like the bears he tracked, all corded muscle and raw strength earned from surviving winters that killed weaker men. His dark hair fell past his shoulders, and his beard was thick enough to protect his face from the bitter cold. Most folks in Fort Lyon gave him a wide berth. They called him wild, dangerous, untamed. He'd come to Colorado territory to forget, to escape the memories of war and loss that haunted him from Missouri. The mountains had become his sanctuary, the silence his companion. He had no interest in women or companionship, or anything that might tie him down or make him vulnerable again. But the story of a woman who could gentle a grizzly bear sparked something in his chest he thought had died years ago. Curiosity. The next morning, Kade loaded his horse and headed up the mountain trail where the trapper said he'd seen the woman. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, covering the landscape in pristine white that glittered under the weak winter sun. He tracked for 3 hours before he found the cave where the bear had denned. The massive animal lay just inside the entrance, its breathing steady, a bandage made from torn cloth wrapped around its shoulder. Kade dismounted quietly, his hand moving to the rifle on his saddle. Then he saw her. She emerged from deeper in the cave, carrying an armful of pine branches. She couldn't have been more than 23 or 24, with golden hair braided down her back and eyes the color of summer sage. She wore a heavy wool coat that was too big for her slender frame and boots that had seen better days. When she spotted him, she didn't scream or run. She simply stopped and met his gaze with a steadiness that took him off guard. "You here to kill him?" she asked, her voice clear and direct. Kade found himself at a loss for words, which never happened. "Just looking." "Well, you found him. He's healing. Another week and he'll be strong enough to move to a better den." She walked past Kade like he wasn't a 6'4" wall of muscle and danger, dropping the pine branches near the cave entrance. "That bear could kill you without thinking twice," Kade said, finally finding his voice. "So could you, I imagine," Josephine replied, brushing snow from her coat. "But I don't think either of you will." The bear lifted its enormous head, sniffing the air. Kade tensed, but the animal simply watched Josephine with what could only be described as affection. She moved to its side, running her hand along its fur, checking the bandage with practiced efficiency. "What happened to him?" Kade asked, despite himself. "Trap. Some fool left it up here illegally. Tore through muscle and tendon. I found him 2 days ago, managed to get the trap off and clean the wound." She glanced up at Kade. "You're the mountain man everyone talks about. Kade Sullivan." "Word travels. Small town. Smaller when you're the woman who lives in a cabin by herself and talks to animals." She said it without bitterness, just fact. "I'm Josephine Anders." Kade watched as she pulled out a canteen and poured water into a small bowl for the bear. The animal drank gratefully, then settled its head back down with a contented rumble. Everything about this situation defied logic. Bears didn't trust humans. They certainly didn't let them tend wounds and bring them water. And women didn't survive alone in the Colorado mountains in the dead of winter. "Where's your cabin?" he asked. 2 miles east. I have a horse, chickens, a milk cow, and 3 dogs. Before you ask, yes, I manage fine on my own. I've been here 3 years. 3 years. That explained why he'd never encountered her. He kept to the western ridges mostly, only coming to Fort Lyon when supplies ran low. "Why?" She looked at him properly then, and he saw something in her eyes he recognized, the same thing he saw when he caught his reflection in mountain streams. Loss, pain, the kind that carved itself into your soul. Same reason you're up here, I expect, she said quietly. The world down there didn't have a place for me anymore. The bear shifted, and Josephine immediately returned her attention to it, murmuring soft words that seemed to soothe the massive creature. Kade should have left, should have mounted his horse and returned to his own business. Instead, he found himself asking, "You need help?" Josephine's eyebrows rose. "With what?" "Getting him moved when he's ready. That's 1,000 pounds of animal. Can't do it alone." She studied him for a long moment, and Kade felt like she could see straight through all the walls he'd built. "Why would you help?" "Because watching you with that bear is the most remarkable thing I've seen in 8 years. Because you're not afraid of me. Because something in your eyes calls to something in mine." "Got nothing better to do," he said instead. A small smile touched her lips. "All right then, come back in a week. I'll be here at dawn." Kade nodded and turned to leave, but her voice stopped him. "Kade?" He looked back. "Thank you." Those 2 words, spoken with genuine warmth, hit him harder than they should have. He managed a grunt of acknowledgement and swung himself onto his horse, riding away before he could do something foolish like stay longer. The week that followed was the longest of Kade's life. He tried to focus on his traps, on restocking firewood, on all the mundane tasks that filled his days. But his mind kept drifting to golden hair and sage green eyes and a woman who could gentle a grizzly bear. He told himself his interest was purely practical. She was alone in the mountains, vulnerable despite her skills. Someone should check on her. But deep down, in the places he tried not to examine too closely, Kade knew it was more than that. When dawn broke on the 7th day, he was already riding toward the cave. He arrived to find Josephine there before him, talking softly to the bear while checking its wound. The animal was standing now, putting weight on the injured leg. "Healed faster than I expected," Josephine said when she heard Kade approach. "He's strong." "Where are we moving him?" Kade asked, dismounting. "There's a cave system about a mile north. Deeper, more protected. He'll be safer there." She looked at the bear, affection clear in her expression. "Won't you, Atlas?" "You named him?" He needed a name. Atlas seemed fitting for something so powerful. She scratched behind the bear's ear, and the animal leaned into her touch like a dog. Kade shook his head in amazement. "How do you do it?" "The animal thing." Josephine was quiet for a moment, then said, "My grandmother was Arapaho. She taught me that animals aren't so different from us. They feel fear, pain, love. If you approach them with respect and patience, they know. They understand." She met his eyes. "Most people don't bother to try. They see wild animals as things to conquer or kill or run from. But there's another way. Your grandmother teach you anything about wild mountain men?" The words were out before Kade could stop them, and he wanted to kick himself for the awkwardness. But Josephine laughed, a sound like water over stones. She might have mentioned something about patience and respect working on them too. The bear started moving toward the cave entrance, clearly ready to leave. Josephine walked beside him, one hand resting lightly on his shoulder, guiding him through the snow. Kade followed, leading his horse, watching this impossible scene unfold. The morning sun painted everything in shades of gold and white, and for the first time in years, Kade felt something shift in his chest, something that felt dangerously close to hope. Moving Atlas to his new den took most of the morning. The bear moved slowly, favoring his injured leg, but he followed Josephine with complete trust. When they finally got him settled in the deeper cave, Josephine spent another half-hour making sure he was comfortable, bringing him water and some fish she'd brought in her pack. "You'll be fine now," she told the bear, stroking his massive head. "You rest and heal, and come spring, you'll be strong as ever." Atlas made a low rumbling sound and nuzzled against her hand. Then, to Kade's astonishment, the bear looked directly at him and dipped its head, almost like a nod of acknowledgement. "He's thanking you," Josephine said softly. "Bears don't thank people." "This one does." She gave Atlas one final pat and stood, brushing snow from her knees. "I should get back. The chickens will be furious if I'm late with their breakfast." They walked together through the snow, leading their horses. The silence between them was comfortable, natural. Kade couldn't remember the last time he'd felt at ease with another person. "You really live alone out here?" he asked. "No family?" "Parents died when I was 19. Cholera. I had a brother, but he joined the army, went south after the war ended. Haven't heard from him in 3 years." Josephine's voice was matter-of-fact, but Kade heard the pain underneath. "I tried living with my aunt in Kansas City after that, but she wanted me to marry a banker who treated people like property. I couldn't do it, so I took what little money I had and came here." "That's brave." She glanced at him surprised. "Or crazy. Sometimes they're the same thing." Kade found himself wanting to tell her his own story, which was strange because he never talked about his past. "I lost my whole family. Mother, father, 2 sisters. Raiders came through our farm in Missouri during the war. I was 17, out hunting. Came back to find everything burned." Josephine stopped walking. Her hand found his arm, and even through the layers of clothing, he felt the warmth of her touch. "I'm so sorry. Joined the army after that. Spent 4 years fighting. Came out here when it ended because I couldn't stand to be around people anymore. Couldn't stand their questions, their pity, their expectation that I'd just move on and be normal." The words poured out of him like water from a broken dam. "Mountains don't ask questions." "No," Josephine agreed quietly. "They don't, but they don't offer much comfort either." Kade looked at her, really looked at her, and saw his own loneliness reflected back. They were both hiding, both wounded, both trying to survive in a harsh world that had taken too much from them. But there was strength in her too, a resilience that drew him in. "Your cabin near here?" he asked. "Just over that ridge." She pointed east. "You want to see it?" He should say no, should maintain his distance, keep his walls intact. But Kade found himself nodding. Josephine's cabin was small but well built, nestled in a clearing surrounded by pine trees. Smoke curled from the chimney, and as they approached, 3 dogs came bounding through the snow, barking excitedly. They surrounded Josephine, tails wagging furiously. "This is Bear, Wolf, and Fox," she said, laughing as the dogs jumped around her. "I'm not very creative with names." The dogs turned their attention to Kade, and he expected growls or wariness. Instead, they approached him with cautious curiosity, sniffing his hands before Fox, the smallest of the 3, licked his fingers. "They like you," Josephine said, sounding pleased. "That's a good sign." "Of what?" "That you're not as wild and dangerous as everyone thinks." She smiled and headed toward the cabin. "Come on, I'll make coffee. Real coffee, not the tar they serve at the Fort Lyon Saloon." The interior of the cabin was warm and surprisingly cozy. Josephine had made it a home, with curtains on the windows, quilts on the bed, books on a shelf carved into the wall. A black potbelly stove radiated heat, and the smell of bread baking filled the air. "You made bread?" Kade asked, amazed. "I make it twice a week. Have to keep my sourdough starter fed." Josephine hung her coat on a peg and moved to the stove, pouring coffee from a pot into 2 tin cups. "Sit. You look like you're expecting the walls to cave in." Kade realized he was standing rigid by the door, uncomfortable in the enclosed space. He forced himself to relax, pulling out a chair at the small wooden table. Josephine handed him coffee and sat across from him, her hands wrapped around her own cup. "When's the last time you were inside a house?" she asked gently. 2 months, when I got supplies in town." He sipped the coffee and nearly groaned. It was perfect, strong and hot, and nothing like the bitter swill he made over campfires. "This is good." "Thank you." Josephine watched him over the rim of her cup. "You can come here whenever you want, for coffee, for bread, for conversation. You don't have to stay alone all the time." The offer was simple, but it felt like a lifeline. Kade's first instinct was to refuse, to maintain his isolation. But looking at Josephine, at the genuine kindness in her eyes, he found he didn't want to. "I might take you up on that," he said. They talked for hours. Josephine told him about the animals she'd helped over the years: a wolf with a broken leg, an eagle with a damaged wing, even a mountain lion kitten whose mother had been killed by hunters. Kade told her about the mountains, the best places to fish, where the elk herded in winter, the hidden valleys where wildflowers bloomed in summer. The conversation flowed easily, naturally, like they'd known each other for years instead of days. When Kade finally left, the sun was setting, painting the snow orange and pink. Josephine walked him to his horse, the dogs trailing behind them. "Come back soon," she said. "I mean it." Kade looked down at her, this small woman who'd somehow managed to crack through his defenses without even trying. "I will." He kept his word. 3 days later, he returned with fresh trout from a stream and found Josephine teaching one of her chickens to perch on her arm. A week after that, he helped her repair a section of fence the cow had knocked down. Each visit lasted longer than the last. They fell into an easy rhythm, working together, talking, sometimes just existing in comfortable silence. February turned to March, and the snow began to melt. Kade found himself spending more time at Josephine's cabin than his own camp. He told himself he was just being neighborly, helping her prepare for spring. But the truth was harder to ignore. He was falling for her laugh, her kindness, her strength, the way she saw the world with wonder instead of fear. One afternoon in late March, they were walking through the woods near her cabin when they heard gunshots. Josephine tensed, her hand immediately going to the knife she kept on her belt. "Stay close," Kade said, moving in front of her protectively. They found the source of the shots quickly. 3 men on horses, drunk and shooting at anything that moved. Kade recognized them as troublemakers from Fort Lyon, the kind who came to the mountains to cause problems. "Well, well," one of them slurred when he spotted Kade and Josephine. "Look what we got here, the wild man and the witch woman." Kade's jaw tightened. "Right on, you're on private property." "This ain't nobody's property, these are open mountains." The man's eyes slid to Josephine, and something ugly crossed his face. "Heard you got away with animals, lady. That include taming wild men? Or you just spreading your legs to stay warm up here?" Kade moved before the man finished speaking, grabbing the horse's bridle and yanking the rider down. The man hit the ground hard, and Kade was on him, one massive fist drawn back. "Kade, don't!" Josephine's voice cut through his rage. He froze, breathing hard, every muscle in his body screaming for violence. But he looked at Josephine and saw not fear, but trust. She believed he could control himself, that he was more than the violence that had defined so much of his life. Slowly, Kade stood, releasing the man. "Get out of here, all of you. And if I hear you've been causing trouble up here again, you'll wish I'd hit you." The men scrambled onto their horses and rode off, cursing and shouting threats. When they were gone, Kade's hands were shaking. The rage still burned in his chest, hot and familiar. "Hey," Josephine said softly, stepping in front of him. "Look at me." He met her eyes. "You stopped. You controlled it. That took more strength than hitting him would have." "He talked about you like you were nothing," Kade said, his voice rough. "I wanted to kill him for it." "I know." Josephine reached up, her small hand resting against his bearded cheek. "But you didn't. Because you're not the wild, dangerous man everyone thinks you are. You're just Kade. And Kade is a good man." Something in him broke at those words. All the walls he'd built, all the distance he'd maintained, crumbled. He pulled Josephine close, wrapping his arms around her, and she came willingly, pressing her face against his chest. "I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted, the words muffled against her hair. "Every morning I wake up and you're the first thing on my mind. I tried to fight it, tried to stay away, but I can't." Josephine pulled back enough to look up at him. "Then don't fight it. I think about you too. Constantly. When you're here, everything feels right. When you're gone, I'm counting the hours until I see you again." Kade cupped her face in his calloused hands, marveling at how delicate she seemed, how fierce. "They say you've got away with wild animals." A smile played at her lips. "What do you say?" "I say you tamed me easy enough." He leaned down, giving her time to pull away, but she rose up to meet him instead. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, like they were both afraid of breaking something precious. Then, Josephine's arms wrapped around his neck, and Kade deepened the kiss, pouring years of loneliness and longing into it. She tasted like coffee and honey and home, and when they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Kade knew with absolute certainty that he'd never let her go. "Stay with me tonight," Josephine whispered. "I don't want you to leave. I'll stay as long as you'll have me." They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, the dogs trailing behind them. Inside, Josephine lit candles while Kade built up the fire. They moved around each other with practiced ease, like they'd done this 1,000 times before. When Josephine brought out bread and cheese for dinner, they sat close at the small table, knees touching, stealing glances and smiles. After dinner, they sat by the fire. Josephine leaned against Kade's chest, his arms wrapped around her, and they watched the flames dance. It was perfect, peaceful, everything Kade hadn't known he needed. "Tell me something nobody else knows," Josephine said softly. Kade thought for a moment. "When I first came to these mountains, I was so angry at the world I could barely see straight. I wanted to disappear, to become as wild and untamed as the land. For a while I did. Went months without speaking to another person. Forgot what it felt like to be human." He tightened his arms around her. "You reminded me. The first time I saw you with that bear, something woke up inside me. Something I thought was dead." Josephine turned in his arms, her eyes searching his face. "You reminded me too, that I could trust someone again, that not everyone would try to change me or use me. You see me, Kade. Really see me. And you're not afraid." "How could I be afraid of someone so extraordinary?" She kissed him then, and this time there was nothing tentative about it. Kade stood, lifting her easily, and carried her to the bed. They undressed each other slowly, reverently, discovering scars and stories written on skin. When they finally came together, it was with a tenderness that made Kade's throat tight. This wasn't just physical. It was a joining of two souls who'd been lost and found each other in the wilderness. Afterward, they lay tangled together under quilts, the fire casting warm shadows across the walls. Josephine traced the scars on Kade's chest, mapping the evidence of his hard life. "I love you," she said simply. "I know it's fast, but I've never been more certain of anything." Kade caught her hand, bringing it to his lips. "I love you too. Probably since that first day, if I'm honest. You're everything I didn't know I was looking for." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and for the first time in 8 years, Kade's dreams were peaceful. Spring arrived in full force over the next few weeks. The mountains came alive with new growth, streams rushing with snowmelt, meadows erupting in wildflowers. Kade officially moved into Josephine's cabin, though he kept his old camp maintained for trapping season. They fell into a life together that felt both brand new and ancient, like they'd been meant for this all along. Word spread in Fort Lyon about the mountain man and the woman with the animals. Some folks were scandalized, saying it wasn't proper. Others were fascinated, coming up with wild stories about the couple who lived like pioneers in the high country. Kade and Josephine didn't care much what people said. They had each other, and that was enough. In April, a rancher named Thomas Harper rode up to the cabin with a problem. His prize bull had gone mad, goring 2 ranch hands and terrorizing the property. He was planning to shoot it, but heard about Josephine's gift with animals and wanted to try one last thing. "I'll pay you good money if you can help," Harper said, hat in hand. "That bull's worth a fortune, but I can't risk my men's lives." Josephine agreed, and Kade insisted on coming along. They rode down to Harper's ranch the next morning, finding the bull penned in a reinforced enclosure, bellowing and charging the fence. "Something's wrong with him," Josephine said immediately. "Bulls don't just go mad like this without reason." She approached the pen slowly while Kade and Harper watched nervously. The bull charged the fence, but Josephine didn't flinch. She started humming, that same melody Kade had heard about from the old trapper, and incredibly, the bull slowed. It pawed the ground, still agitated, but listening. "Let me in," Josephine said. "Absolutely not," Kade said immediately. "That thing will kill you." She looked back at him, and he saw complete confidence in her eyes. "Trust me." It went against every protective instinct Kade had, but he'd learned that Josephine knew what she was doing. He nodded reluctantly and helped Harper open the gate just wide enough for her to slip through. The bull charged immediately. Kade's heart stopped, but Josephine stood her ground, still humming. The bull pulled up short, snorting, confused by this small human who didn't fear it. Josephine kept humming, kept approaching slowly. When she was close enough, she reached out and touched the bull's head. It took 20 minutes, but gradually the bull calmed. Josephine examined it carefully and found the problem: a deep splinter embedded in its shoulder, infected and causing constant pain. With Kade's help through the fence, she managed to remove it and clean the wound. The bull stood docile through the whole process, like it understood she was helping. "He'll be fine now," Josephine said, stroking the bull's neck. "Keep the wound clean, and his temperament should return to normal in a few days." Harper was stunned. He paid Josephine triple what he'd promised and told everyone in Fort Lyon about what he'd witnessed. After that, people started coming to Josephine regularly with animal problems. A horse that wouldn't let anyone ride it, a dog that had turned aggressive after abuse, even wild animals that wandered into town and caused panic. Josephine helped them all, and Kade was always by her side, protective and proud. Watching her work with animals never stopped amazing him. She had patience and empathy that seemed limitless, seeing past fear and aggression to the pain underneath. In May, they took a trip to check on Atlas. The bear had moved from the cave, healthy and strong, and they found him fishing in a stream. When he saw Josephine, he walked right up to her, and she scratched behind his ears like he was a pet dog. "You did good, big guy," she told him. "Look at you, all healed up." Atlas made a contented rumbling sound, and then did something that made Kade laugh. The bear looked at him, walked over, and bumped his massive head against Kade's chest in what could only be described as a greeting. "I think he remembers you," Josephine said, delighted. "Never thought I'd be friends with a grizzly bear," Kade admitted, carefully patting Atlas's shoulder. "But then, I never thought a lot of things before I met you." They spent the afternoon by the stream, watching Atlas fish, enjoying the warm spring sunshine. On the ride back, Kade felt a contentment he'd never experienced. Life was good, simple, but rich in ways that mattered. That night, back at the cabin, Kade built up his courage for something he'd been thinking about for weeks. They were sitting on the porch watching the stars come out when he pulled a small wooden box from his pocket. "Josephine," he started, then had to clear his throat because emotion was clogging it. "I never thought I'd have this. A home, someone to love, a reason to wake up looking forward to the day. You gave me all that. You took a wild, broken man and showed him he could be whole again." Josephine's eyes were wide, her hand pressed to her mouth. Kade opened the box, revealing a simple gold band he'd bought on his last trip to Fort Lyon. "I know we haven't known each other long, but I've never been more certain of anything. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Josephine breathed, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, absolutely yes." He slipped the ring on her finger, and she threw her arms around him, laughing and crying at the same time. Kade held her tight, feeling like the luckiest man alive. They were married in June by a traveling preacher who came through Fort Lyon. The ceremony was small, held in the meadow near their cabin with wildflowers blooming everywhere. Thomas Harper and his wife attended, along with a few other folks from town who'd gotten to know Josephine through her work with animals. The old trapper who'd first seen Josephine with Atlas was there too, grinning like he'd personally made the match. Josephine wore a simple white dress she'd sewn herself, with wildflowers in her hair. Kade had trimmed his beard and wore clean clothes, though he refused to cut his hair. When they exchanged vows, promising to love and protect each other for the rest of their lives, there wasn't a dry eye in the meadow. The celebration afterward was lively, with music and dancing and more food than Kade had seen in years. But his favorite part was when the sun started to set, and he and Josephine slipped away, walking hand in hand back to their cabin while the party continued behind them. "Happy?" he asked, pulling her close. "Happier than I ever imagined I could be," Josephine replied, reaching up to kiss him. "I love you, Kade Sullivan." "I love you too, Josephine Sullivan." He liked the sound of that, her name joined with his. Their first year of marriage was blissful. They worked together, building up their homestead, helping animals, becoming a fixture in the Fort Lyon community despite living miles from town. Josephine's reputation grew, and people came from farther and farther away seeking her help with difficult animals. Kade took on work as a hunting guide, leading wealthy men from back east into the mountains. It paid well and let him use his knowledge of the land. But his favorite days were the quiet ones, when it was just him and Josephine and the animals, living the simple life they had built together. In their second spring as a married couple, Josephine discovered she was pregnant. Kade was terrified and thrilled in equal measure. The thought of being a father, of having a family again after losing his first one so violently, scared him more than he wanted to admit. "What if I can't protect you?" he asked one night, his hand resting on Josephine's still flat stomach. "What if something happens?" Then we'll face it together, Josephine said firmly. But Kade, you can't live in fear of losing us. We're here, we're real, and we're going to build a beautiful life. Our child will know they're loved, that they're safe, that they have a father who would move mountains for them. Her confidence steadied him. As Josephine's belly grew, Kade threw himself into preparing. He expanded the cabin, adding a room for the baby. He stockpiled supplies, hunted extra meat to dry and store, did everything he could to ensure they'd be comfortable through the winter. Josephine continued working with animals well into her pregnancy, though Kade insisted on being present for anything potentially dangerous. In August, a wolf pack had been terrorizing sheep near Fort Lyon, and the ranchers wanted to kill them. Josephine convinced them to let her try something else first. She and Kade tracked the pack into the mountains and found the reason for their boldness. The alpha female had been caught in a trap and couldn't hunt. The pack was starving, desperate enough to risk attacking livestock. Josephine spent 3 days gaining the wolves' trust, and Kade watched in awe as she eventually got close enough to free the injured alpha. The ranchers were skeptical until the wolf attack stopped completely. The pack moved to a different territory, well away from the sheep. Josephine's legend grew, and Kade couldn't have been prouder. Their son was born in November, during the first snowfall of the season. The birth was hard, and there were moments when Kade feared he might lose Josephine. But she was strong, stronger than anyone he'd ever known, and when the baby's first cry filled the cabin, Kade wept with relief and joy. They named him James, after Josephine's father, and from the moment Kade held his son, he knew what it meant to have something worth living for beyond survival. This tiny person, with Josephine's eyes and a strong grip even as a newborn, was his future, his hope, his reason to be better. Josephine recovered quickly from the birth, and they fell into the rhythm of new parenthood. Sleepless nights, constant feedings, the wonder of watching James grow and change. The dogs appointed themselves guardians, sleeping by the baby's cradle. Even the chickens seemed to know to be quieter when James was sleeping. In the spring, when James was 5 months old, they took him on his first trip to check on Atlas. The bear had found a mate and had cubs of his own. When Atlas saw Josephine, he approached carefully, and she introduced him to James. "This is my son," she said softly. "He's precious to me, Atlas. Do you understand?" The bear sniffed the baby gently, then made a soft sound and touched his nose to James's head, like a blessing. Kade's throat tightened at the sight. His wife, his son, and a 1,000-pound grizzly bear having a moment of perfect peace. Years passed in a blur of happiness. James grew into a bright, curious boy who inherited his mother's way with animals and his father's strength. At 3, he could calm the dogs with a word. At 5, he helped Josephine tend to injured deer. Kade taught him to track, to hunt, to respect the mountains and everything living in them. They had a daughter when James was 4, a little girl they named Sarah after Kade's mother. She was fierce from birth, demanding and loud and absolutely perfect. The cabin rang with children's laughter, with the sounds of a family living and loving. Fort Lyon grew around them, changing from a rough frontier town to a more settled community. But Kade and Josephine stayed in their cabin in the mountains, raising their children, helping animals, building a life that was rich in all the ways that mattered. When James was 7 and Sarah was 3, a group of men from a university back east came to Fort Lyon specifically to meet Josephine. They'd heard stories about the woman who could communicate with wild animals and wanted to study her methods. Josephine was hesitant at first, but Kade encouraged her. "What you do is remarkable," he said. "If you can teach others, help more animals, isn't that worth it?" She agreed to meet with them, and for a week, the professors and students camped near the cabin, watching Josephine work. She showed them how to approach animals with patience and respect, how to read body language, how to understand that fear and aggression usually came from pain or trauma. One of the professors was particularly taken with her work. "Mrs. Sullivan, you're revolutionizing our understanding of animal behavior. Would you consider writing a book about your methods?" Josephine looked at Kade, who nodded encouragingly. "I suppose I could," she said slowly, "if it would help people see animals differently." Over the next year, Josephine worked on her book with Kade's help. He listened to her ideas, wrote down her stories, helped her organize years of experience into something teachable. When it was finally published, Understanding Through Compassion, a guide to working with wild animals, became surprisingly popular, especially among ranchers and farmers tired of killing animals that were just scared or hurt. Josephine received letters from all over the country, people thanking her for helping them see animals in a new light. She answered every one, and sometimes people came to stay at the cabin for a few weeks, learning directly from her. Through it all, Kade was her foundation. He protected their family, provided for them, and never stopped looking at Josephine like she was the most amazing thing he'd ever seen. Because to him, she was. On their 10th wedding anniversary, they took a trip without the children, leaving them with the Harpers for a week. They rode deep into the mountains to a valley Kade had discovered years ago but never shown anyone. It was paradise. A crystal-clear lake surrounded by peaks still capped with snow, meadows full of wildflowers, herds of elk grazing peacefully. They made camp by the lake and spent the days fishing, swimming, making love under the stars like they had when they first fell for each other. "Do you ever regret it?" Josephine asked one night, lying in Kade's arms. "Giving up your solitary life for all this chaos and family and responsibility?" Kade laughed. "Are you serious? Josephine, before you, I was barely alive. I was existing, surviving, but not living. You gave me everything. A reason to wake up, someone to love, children who make every day an adventure. I've never regretted a single moment. Even when Sarah screamed for 3 hours straight because you wouldn't let her keep the baby skunk she found?" "Okay, maybe I regretted that moment a little," Kade admitted, and they both laughed. "But even the hard parts are better than the best days of my old life, because I'm doing it with you." Josephine kissed him, slow and deep. "I love you so much. You took a lonely woman who talked to animals and made her feel like the most important person in the world. That's because you are. To me, to our children, to all those animals you've helped over the years. You're extraordinary, Josephine. Always have been." They made love under the stars, surrounded by the wild beauty of the mountains, and Kade thought about how far they'd both come. Two broken people who'd found each other in the wilderness and built something beautiful. When they returned home, James and Sarah ran to meet them, chattering excitedly about everything that had happened while they were gone. Sarah had apparently tried to teach the chickens to follow her in a line, which had ended in chaos. James had helped Mr. Harper with an ornery horse and done such a good job that Harper had paid him his first real wage. Life settled back into its comfortable rhythm. The children grew. The homestead prospered. Josephine's work with animals continued to help people and creatures throughout Colorado Territory and beyond. Kade guided hunters and trappers, teaching them to respect the land and take only what they needed. When Colorado became a state in 1876, there was a big celebration in Fort Lyon. Kade and Josephine brought the children to town for the festivities, and it struck Kade how much had changed. Fort Lyon was a real town now, with proper buildings, a school, even a small hospital. But the mountains remained the same, wild and beautiful and home. "You ever think about moving to town?" Josephine asked, watching Sarah dance with other children while James tried to look too mature to participate. "Not even for a second," Kade replied. "Why would we leave paradise?" More years passed. James grew into a young man who combined his mother's empathy with his father's strength, becoming known as the best animal handler in 3 counties. Sarah became a force of nature, equally comfortable wrestling her brother and gently nursing injured creatures back to health. When Kade turned 45, Josephine threw him a surprise party. Half of Fort Lyon showed up, along with people from neighboring towns who'd benefited from Josephine's work over the years. Even some of the university professors who'd studied with her made the journey. "Speech!" someone called, and the crowd took up the chant. Kade stood reluctantly, uncomfortable being the center of attention. But he looked around at all these people, at his children standing proud, at Josephine smiling at him with love in her eyes, and found words. "I'm not much for talking," he started, and everyone laughed because it was true. "But I want to say something about the woman I married. When I met Josephine, I was about as wild as a man could get. I'd given up on people, on connection, on everything except surviving another day. And then I saw her with a grizzly bear, being gentle and kind to a creature that could have killed her without a thought." He paused, emotion thick in his throat. "She had a way with wild animals," everyone said. And they were right. But more than that, She had a way of seeing the good in everyone and everything. She looked at me, this rough, angry mountain man, and saw someone worth saving. She tamed me easy enough, not by breaking my spirit, but by showing me it was safe to be human again, safe to love, to trust, to build a life. Josephine was crying now, and Kade's own eyes were wet. Everything good in my life came from her, my children, my home, my purpose. So thank you all for coming, but this party isn't really for me. It's for Josephine, the most extraordinary woman I've ever known, who taught a wild man what it means to be truly alive. The crowd erupted in applause, and Josephine came to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "I love you," she whispered against his chest. "I love you too. Always will." The party continued late into the night, but eventually everyone left, and Kade and Josephine walked home under the stars with their children. James and Sarah were arguing good-naturedly about something, their voices carrying in the quiet mountain air. "We did good," Josephine said softly. Kade looked at his family, at the life they'd built, and nodded. "Yeah, we really did." As they approached the cabin, 3 dogs ran to greet them, older now but still loyal. The chickens were roosting for the night, the cow was in her small barn, and smoke from the fire curled into the night sky. It was home. It was everything. That night, after the children were asleep, Kade and Josephine sat on their porch like they had countless times over the years. The mountains rose around them, dark against the star-filled sky. "Do you remember the first thing you said to me?" Josephine asked. "Just looking," Kade replied, smiling at the memory. "I was so thrown by you. This beautiful woman in a cave with a grizzly bear, acting like it was the most normal thing in the world. And do you remember what I said when people asked how I tamed wild animals? You said it was about patience and respect." Josephine leaned her head on his shoulder. "Same thing I used on you." Kade laughed, the sound rumbling through his chest. "Everyone in town used to say you had a way with wild animals. They were talking about bears and wolves and mountain lions. But you know what I said? Tell me again. I never get tired of hearing it." I said, "She tamed me easy enough." Kade pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling grateful for every moment that had led them here. "And it was true. You did. Not by making me something I wasn't, but by loving me exactly as I was and showing me I could be more." They sat in comfortable silence, 2 souls who'd found each other against all odds, built a life in the wilderness, raised children who would carry their legacy forward. The wild animals they'd helped over the years were out there in the darkness, living their lives because of Josephine's compassion. The community they'd joined was better because they'd chosen to be part of it, instead of hiding away. "You know what the best part is?" Josephine said after a while. "What's that?" "We still have so many years ahead of us, so many more adventures, more animals to help, more memories to make. Our story isn't over, Kade. It's still being written." He kissed the top of her head. "Then let's make sure it's a good one." The years that followed proved Josephine right. They had many more adventures ahead of them. James married a woman from Fort Lyon who shared his passion for animals, and they started their own homestead nearby. Sarah surprised everyone by falling in love with one of the university professors who'd come to study with Josephine, a kind man who saw her fierce spirit and loved her for it. Kade and Josephine became grandparents, and their cabin was often filled with grandchildren learning the same lessons they'd taught their own kids: how to respect the land, how to understand animals, how to live with compassion and strength. They grew old together, silver creeping into Josephine's golden hair, Kade's powerful frame weathered but still strong. They still took trips into the mountains, though shorter ones now. They still helped animals, though they trained others to do more of the physical work. On their 30th wedding anniversary, Kade took Josephine back to the cave where they'd first met, where she'd been tending Atlas all those years ago. The bear was long gone, likely passed on, but his legacy remained. Because of that day, because of Josephine's compassion for a wounded grizzly, Kade had found his way back to humanity. "Do you ever think about how different our lives could have been?" Josephine asked, standing at the cave entrance. "If that trapper hadn't come to town, if you hadn't heard his story, if you'd decided not to investigate." "All the time," Kade admitted. "And every time, I'm grateful for whatever force in the universe brought us together." You saved me, Josephine. In every way a person can be saved. We saved each other, she corrected gently. I was so lonely before you. I had the animals, but I needed human connection too. You gave me that. You gave me love and family and a partnership that made everything better. They stood together, looking out at the mountains they'd called home for 3 decades, and Kade marveled at the journey they'd taken. From 2 broken, lonely souls to the center of a thriving family. From isolation to connection. From surviving to truly living. As the sun set over the peaks, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Kade and Josephine headed back to their cabin. Their children would be there soon for the anniversary dinner Josephine had planned, bringing grandchildren and laughter and all the beautiful chaos of a life well lived. I love you, Kade said as they walked, hand in hand like they'd done thousands of times before. More than I could ever put into words. I love you too, Josephine replied, squeezing his hand. My wild mountain man who turned out to have the gentlest heart of all. That night, surrounded by family, Kade stood and raised a glass for a toast. To 30 years with the most remarkable woman I've ever known. To the life we built, the children we raised, the animals we helped, and the love that made it all possible. People used to say Josephine had a way with wild animals, and they were right. But what they didn't know was that she didn't tame us by breaking our spirits. She did it by showing us that being wild and being gentle aren't opposites. That strength and compassion can exist together. That love isn't a weakness, but the most powerful force there is. He looked at Josephine, his wife, his partner, his everything. She tamed me easy enough, and I've never been more grateful for anything in my life. The family cheered, and Josephine came to stand beside him, tears streaming down her face. Their children and grandchildren surrounded them, a testament to the love that had started in a cave with a wounded bear and a lonely mountain man. As the celebration continued late into the night, with music and dancing and stories being shared, Kade pulled Josephine outside for a moment of quiet. The stars blazed overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their first kiss, their wedding, every important moment of their lives together. Happy? He asked, the same question he'd asked her 3 decades ago. Happier than I ever imagined possible, Josephine answered, the same response she'd given then. Some things, Kade reflected, never changed. The mountains remained steadfast, the stars eternal, and his love for Josephine as strong as the day they met. They'd built a life that mattered, touched countless lives, both human and animal, and created a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. The wild mountain man and the woman who could gentle grizzly bears had found each other in the wilderness and created something extraordinary, not by taming each other's wild spirits, but by honoring them, nurturing them, and loving each other exactly as they were. As they stood under the stars, Kade pulled Josephine close and knew with absolute certainty that this was how love was supposed to be. Wild and gentle, fierce and tender, strong enough to weather any storm and soft enough to heal any wound. Come on, Josephine said, taking his hand. Let's get back to our family. And together, they walked back into the light and warmth of the cabin, into the embrace of the life they'd built, into the future they'd continue to write together for as long as they both lived. Because their story, the story of the mountain man and the woman with a way with wild animals, was one for the ages. A testament to the power of love, compassion, and the courage to let yourself be tamed by the right person. And in the mountains of Colorado, where wild animals roamed and legends were born, their love would be remembered forever.